Good morning, guys. Thank you for joining me for Walking with the Word this morning. This morning I want to share with you an account of worship that made Jesus stop and say, oh, wow, that was beautiful. It was so beautiful, in fact, that Jesus said that it would be told in all the world wherever the gospel is proclaimed. And I want to read this and unpack it this morning. So we're reading from Matthew 26, but the account's recorded in other gospels too. And we're going to start from verse 6. So it says, "Now, when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment, and she poured it out on his head as he reclined at the table. And when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, 'Why this waste? For this could have been given and sold for a large sum of money and given to the poor.' But when Jesus, aware of this, said to them, 'Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a beautiful thing for me. For you will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Truly, I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her.'" So this morning I just want to unpack this and explore what's going on here. So basically Jesus is in this home, he's eating, he's sat down. I want you to picture this. This woman Mary comes in with this alabaster flask and breaks it over his head. Now it helps here to actually know something about the alabaster flask. Basically it contained a really expensive ointment. I mean, we're talking super expensive here. One of the Gospels tells us it was around 300 denarii, which is equivalent to 300 days work as a kind of minimum wage. So I don't know exactly what that will translate to in your country, but it's going to be anything between sort of 15 and 20,000 pounds in UK money. It's a lot of money. We're talking super expensive here. It's not just your average bottle of Chanel. We're talking the highest end, extremely expensive thing. Why was she in possession of this? Why would she have such an expensive bottle of perfume? Well, the answer is that it was a dowry. So basically, as her family accumulated wealth, they invested in things like this as a dowry, which would be given to her husband as a symbol of her family's wealth when she got married. So what's really interesting here is not only do we have a very financially expensive sacrifice, not just a very expensive act of worship, we also have one that represents a lot more to Mary. It means a lot to her in her life because as a single lady, she's presumably waiting to be married, and this would be her offering to her husband. This represents her whole life, her future, her marriage, and she's pouring it all out on Jesus. This act of worship is not just an act of financial giving, it's an act of pouring herself out, her very essence, her life, her future, her hope, her everything, all on Jesus. Jesus, I trust you. Jesus, I love you. There's such a beautiful spontaneity to this act of worship. She pours her life out on Jesus. Do you think there's any way she could go back from this? Can you scrape up the oil? Can you rebuild the flask? No. Once you've broken it and poured it out, that's it. It's irreversibility, this one way, snap, break, crack, destroy the alabaster flask and pour the oil on Jesus. I'm giving myself to him completely, and there's no going back from this. And if you should try and rebuild the flask, what's that going to look like? Imagine what happened if Mary tried to rebuild the alabaster flask. It would just be obvious that it was a broken flask. You'd see the cracks. Once you've poured your life out on Jesus, once you've given yourself to him in the way that Mary gave herself to him, you're not going to be able to rebuild the flask. You'll always see the cracks. It's such a beautiful act of worship. But when you see acts of worship like this level of beauty, spontaneity, and power, there'll always be someone on the sideline just stood there criticising. It's just typical, right? So someone's done such a beautiful, passionate, sweet act of surrendered worship to Jesus. And what happens? There's someone stood on the sideline criticising. Now, we read in John that's actually Judas Iscariot, Judas who betrayed Jesus. And what's really interesting is Judas has a good line, he has a good excuse. He says, couldn't this money have been given to the poor instead? Doesn't that sound so noble? Doesn't that sound so right and so good? You can almost relate to it, can't you? You can almost imagine if you stood there being like, he's got a good point actually, hasn't he? But Jesus said, no, stop. You'll always have the poor with you. You won't always have me. This was a beautiful act of worship. And he even says this shall be proclaimed wherever the gospel is proclaimed around the world, which has become true, hasn't it? So we're reading it today. It's there in the Bible. That prophecy has now been fulfilled. It is something that we tell, whether that was done intentionally or whether that has just kind of happened coincidentally and because Jesus prophesied it. Doesn't matter, it's true. So Judas stood on the sideline, is criticising, and he's sounding pretty clever. It sounds like he's got a good excuse, or he could have given it to the poor. But the Gospel of John tells us that Judas didn't particularly care about the poor. It was more because he was a thief, and seeing such a high value thing, instead of going into his own pocket, going on Jesus, upset him. But what's really interesting is Judas was accusing Mary of waste. Guys, you never waste your life when you pour it out on Jesus. It is not a waste of life to surrender and pour out and give yourself wholly and fully to Jesus. That is never a waste. What's really interesting is actually Judas became known as the son of perdition, and that word perdition means waste. He became known as the son of waste. So despite his seemingly noble protest that the money could have been given to the poor and it was being wasted on Jesus, it turns out that Judas was actually the waste. He was actually the one wasting. He was the son of waste. Guys, you will never waste yourself. Surrendering yourself to Jesus, pouring yourself out on him is never going to be a waste. And what I love is when Jesus recognises this act of worship as beautiful. It's not just good, it's not just right, it's not just correct, it's beautiful. Jesus proclaims it's beautiful. Jesus doesn't use his words lightly. This was an act of worship that touched Jesus. He saw the beauty in it. It was spontaneous, irreversible, full of love, full of beauty. It was not just financially expensive. It wasn't just a great sacrifice to her in terms of money. It was her life being poured out over Jesus. And that's what worship's about, guys. We can do that today. Jesus is right here with you now. You can pour your life on his head and anoint him with this kind of worship right now. It's beautiful. Pouring our lives over Jesus is the best place that we can pour them. Now, what happened after this? Well, you notice there's a particular phrase in the account that says, the fragrance filled the room. When we surrender ourselves to Jesus this way, when we pour ourselves out over his head in this manner, our fragrance fills places. The fragrance fills a room. It's beautiful. Other people get to partake in the beauty of that act of worship. You're blessing the people around you. Your fragrance will just diffuse and fill places when you pour yourself out on Jesus in this way. It's so beautiful. And this idea that Jesus commends her and says this act will be proclaimed wherever the gospel is proclaimed. Now, I've talked a bit recently about success. What should we look for in life? What should we aspire to? And one of the things I've been talking about recently is how success in God's kingdom, success in God's sight, is not success in the way the world defines it. The world has its set of ideas of what a successful life looks like, and usually they involve possessions, money, relationships, ascending to the top of businesses, getting super rich, all those sorts of things. Those are the type of typical world famous things. But I've been saying, no, we need to redefine success according to God's priorities. This is an example of success. Mary, who poured her life over Jesus' head, whose act is proclaimed around the world. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be significant, for your life to matter, for your life to count, to leave a lasting impact and impression on the world. In fact, that's a good thing. And the reason we know that's not a bad thing is because Jesus permits this for Mary. He says, she's going to make a difference around the world, guys. People are going to read about her act of worship and they're going to feel inspired too. She's going to be told and proclaimed along with the gospel of hope. Isn't that exciting? Now, what's really cool is we can have a promise like this too. Our lives can make a difference when we pour our lives out over Jesus and surrender them irreversibly, one way, all out, poured out over him, nothing held back. Jesus can do this in our lives too. Jesus can make our lives make a difference in ways that we don't even know. Maybe not just 10, 20, 30 years down the line, hundreds, thousands of years in different places, different locations, we can make a difference. It's just incredible how God can use things in ways beyond what we can even imagine. I bet Mary didn't get up that day thinking, I'm going to do something that's going to change the world. I'm going to do something that's going to be told and talked about in thousands of years' time. She will have had no idea when she got up. But in that beautiful act of worship, in that moment of utter surrender, that's exactly what she did. She did something that was world-changing. So what I'd like to do now, guys, is just pray for you before I head back. And then I'm going to leave you to get on with your days. Father, thank you for this beautiful act of worship that's recorded in the Gospels for us to learn from and feel inspired by. Help us to pour ourselves out on you completely. Thank you that everything we have, everything we possess is from you, Lord, and help us to pour it over your head. Thank you that you recognise and love and receive our worship. Thank you that you stand up for us against the critics, and thank you that you have the power to change the world through us, Lord. Even if we're broken alabaster flasks, you have the power to change the world through us. You change the world through broken people. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you for joining me today, guys. God bless you. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning. Take care for now. Bye-bye.